business here. Our speaker tonight is Kim Thorburn. She grew up on a farm near Fresno, California, where she was engaged in 4-H activities and much in the outdoors. She chose to go into medicine, and after graduation from UCSF, began to tackle issues, and not easy ones at that. Kim applied herself to topics such as medical care for inmates at San Quentin, and later as director of the Spokane Regional Health District, where she dealt with a variety of important public health issues. Upon retirement from medicine, she was able to return to her love of animals and the out of doors, but she continued her lifelong pattern of working on the larger picture, the bigger picture things, and dedicating herself to bridging and connecting different parties to get things done. She played an important role volunteering in WDFW's sage and sharp-tailed grouse recovery efforts, and served for 8 years as a Washington Fish and Wildlife Commissioner. Kim has served on the Board of WOS as a treasurer and for 2 terms as a director. And she was drawn to birding by way of a class given by the Spokane Audubon Society and by a certain Canyon Wren in the Santa Rosa Mountains of Nevada. Her habitat is in eastern Washington, channeled scablands and sagebrush country. I personally have known Kim through participation in the Chewelah and Colville Christmas bird counts, and also as members of the WOS Board of Directors for a while. And so, Kim, I have a bone to pick with you. You encouraged me to run for vice president a few years ago and said, oh, it's easy, you can do it. And then because no one ran for president, I automatically became president, and I've been that for the last 2 years. So it's all your fault, Kim, but I'm still your friend. So regardless, we're very pleased to have Kim Thorburn as our guest speaker, and I know you will gain a lot from her presentation. So take it away, Kim.
Yeah, touche, Dave. I think that was well deserved. I felt guilty about it for years. That is enticing you to be on the board. So, but
thank you, Kim.
I really enjoyed my years on the board and enjoyed working with Dave. It's an organization that I truly believe in and feel dedicated to, and I feel a little guilty looking at that short list of field trip leaders, and because I promised when I went off the board that I would lead some Eastern Washington field trips. So I'll, since Dave has just guilted me, I'll try to keep the promise. So thank you so much for inviting me to talk about some policy considerations that I feel really quite passionate about, and to share sort of my philosophies and thoughts as I've done field work in wildlife conservation and also participated in policy making, particularly as a Fish and Wildlife Commissioner in this state. My computer seems to be stuck here.
Kim, I think if you click on your PowerPoint, sometimes the machine hasn't decided what it's supposed to listen to.
Oh, there. Okay. Yes. I thought I was doing that. So, okay. Well, tonight I am going to start with a little bit more about my work with prairie grass conservation in the state, because it really laid the foundation for a lot of the thinking that I've been doing about this and the ideas that I have. And I like talking about it. and I love prairie grouse, so I want to share some of those experiences with you. And then that will lead me into sort of the anatomy of the Endangered Species Act and celebration of it, as well as some consideration of its shortcomings, especially in today's world where we're talking about rapid and massive loss of biodiversity, even calling it the 6th great extinction, and how we have progressed in terms of thinking about conservation more as biodiversity than individual species. So, turning to a little bit of history about my work with greater sage-grouse and Columbian sharp-tailed grouse conservation in Washington State. When I retired from public health medicine in 2008, I was sort of looking around for something to do and something to do outdoors and pursuing my interest in wildlife and the environment. And I think at the time I was president of Spokane Audubon Society, and one of our board members was the district biologist for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. And he had mentioned that our district and our region, Region 1 of the Fish and Wildlife Department, was going to be actively involved in recovery of these two birds. And it was going to be fairly intensive work, and he was interested in having volunteers to help. So I like grouse, and I raised my hand. Turning to those two rather sobering charts, it puts together kind of the history of where we are with protection and recovery of greater sage-grouse and Columbian sharp-tailed grouse in Washington. Both birds were at once very abundant, particularly the Columbian sharp-tailed grouse. And as the state began to monitor them, you can see back in the 70s and early 80s, you can see that we were already beginning to see rather dramatic declines in their number. It was the first action that was really taken to deal with this by the State Department of Fish and Wildlife. Both are still considered game birds in the state, was to close hunting seasons. Although the current understanding was that hunting really was not in any way related to the decline, particularly of greater sage-grouse. It probably contributed to a degree to the decline of Columbian sharp-tailed grouse, and actually throughout the 20th century, the hunting season was opened and closed periodically. At the time, sharp-tailed grouse was the most prevalent of game birds in the state, and a very popular one at that. So that was the first action taken. In the 90s, the late 90s, the state made a determination that they should be listed, state listed. And in fact, the greater sage-grouse in Washington was recognized as a distinct population segment and actually federally, well, found to be warranted, but precluded by the federal government under the Federal Endangered Species Act. And at that point, the state, as is required by the state's listing law, began to work on intensive recovery planning for both birds. Both birds have similar approaches to recovery. It's been recognized that the greatest threat to both species has been the dramatic loss of habitat. They're shrub steppe obligates, and as we know, the Columbia Basin shrub steppe has greatly shrunk due to agriculture and development and many human activities. And really the decline matches the loss of their needed habitat. So the recovery efforts for both birds involved land acquisition and habitat restoration and population augmentation, and even attempts at restarting extirpated populations by trapping and translocating birds from other locations, predator management, and population monitoring. And all of those are pretty intensive activities, and that's where volunteering and helping out came in. And if you're wondering what the photograph is all about, it's how you trap sage grouse. You take you go out late at night on cold, muddy leks in the spring with a big butterfly net and a spotlight, and the person with the big butterfly net follows the person with the spotlight around, and the person finds eye shine, and the bird sort of holds still if you sort of strobe into them. And we put the butterfly net over the sage grouse, and that's how we trap them and bring them into the state for translocation. So I've noted some key dates. The listing, they were first listed in the 90s as threatened, and the recovery plans were adopted in the early 2000s. The sharp-tailed Columbia, or the Columbian sharp-tail recovery plan was adopted a little later. However, it was actually written and acted upon about the same time that the sage-grouse recovery plan was adopted. And then, as you can see, there was a little bit of stabilizing of the decline when the recovery plans were adopted. It turns out that a lot of that had to do with the translocations and bringing birds in. When that has been stopped, we start seeing the populations fall off again. Since the decline couldn't really be held, the commission, the Fish and Wildlife Commission, decided that they needed to be uplisted to state endangered. The sharp-tailed grouse first in 2018 and then in 2020. The difference between the threatened and endangered listing is in the state, under state laws, that there are higher penalties for take when they're endangered, but nothing else really changes. As you can see, with all these efforts, the birds are not doing well, and it's been a pretty discouraging lot of effort that has really seen the birds come to a questionable point of survival in the state for both species. The latest threats to them relate to the prolonged droughts and the consequent wildland fires. In 2020, wildland fires burned a huge amount of sage-grouse habitat and sharp-tail habitat. Many of the historic leks burned, and there's been pretty intensive work translocating sharp-tailed grouse to try and assist in recovery, but it's not going well. So again, somewhat discouraging. And it is, this is sort of looking at this graph that, as I said, has been, and my experience with it, that has been foundational to a lot of my thinking and philosophy about wildlife conservation and recovery. As I think was mentioned in my introduction, I am what my husband calls a policy wonk. I love doing projects and programs, but I also am very much drawn to policy. And when a colleague suggested that I take my interest in wildlife conservation and apply for the Fish and Wildlife Commission, I was very much attracted to that. So my 8 years on the commission, actually looking at policy, including the state oversight of endangered and threatened species, has also contributed to the philosophy that I'm going to be presenting to you tonight. So with that, I'm going to start with the Endangered Species Act. Clearly, as is often commented, one of the most important conservation actions in our country. And I want to start off with that because I'm going to be talking, I believe it strongly, but I am going to be talking about what I think are real shortcomings to the Endangered Species Act in today's, the threats of biodiversity loss that we face today. So, but to start off, just kind of at the beginning, the Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973, and at that time, it was sort of Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, and a realization of the human impact on other animal species, particularly, and the need to really start intervening. And I think that was a real underpinning to the act. It was certainly needed. And the purpose, quite simply, was to have law and policy that would help with the recovery of species that were threatened with extinction. In particular, looking at human actions that contributed to the possibility of species extinction. What we think, I think, when we're talking about the Federal Endangered Species Act, and I'll just mention, most states have endangered species acts of some sort that really kind of mirror the federal act, and often they'll have species that they're looking after that aren't necessarily federally endangered. It's very common in Washington. I think, we're often on the sort of edge of ranges in Washington, and very often we'll find that species that aren't as in serious problems in more central portions of the range are facing problems in Washington. So turning back to the act itself, of course, I think one of the things that we think about when we think of the ESA is listing, that we identify species that are in trouble, and then we designate them with a threatened status or an endangered status. And the chart up in the right-hand corner shows the listings since the onset of the Act in 1973 through 2013. This is taken from a very interesting, comprehensive article from Issues of Ecology that analyzed the Act in great detail. I think kind of preparing for the 50th anniversary in 2023. It contains a lot of information that's really quite difficult to pull together. So this only goes through 2023. The article itself was published in 2016. Since 2013, there have been 219 additional species added to this chart. But what I want to point out about it is, as we have thought about, or when it was originally enacted, you'll notice that there weren't invertebrates in the first years of listing, or plants. It was all vertebrate species that were initially listed, and it was quite slowly that invertebrates and plants began to be added to lists, and actually in more recent years, those have been the life entities that have received the greatest number of listings. If you look at it, most of the vertebrate listings have been fairly stable in number through the years, with the exception of fish, and we'll look at a little bit more of that in a few minutes. And to me, that I think underlies the recognition that early on we're focusing on these species that were obviously in trouble at the time of, right before our very eyes, the vertebrates that we, species that we see easily when we're out considering wildlife. And the listing of invertebrates and plants and lichens is a recognition of the fact that you need the whole ecosystem if we're going to be effective in species recovery. So the Act has been really a tremendous success in one regard. As I mentioned, the purpose of the Act was to recover species threatened with extinction. So there's recovery, but there's also preventing extinction. And where it's been highly effective is preventing extinction. A recent article looked at how many extinctions have been prevented by the Act by doing modeling of what would be anticipated extinctions without the Act's intervention, and determined that nearly 300 extinctions have been prevented. In addition, more than 100 species have been de- or downlisted, a few of those due to extinction. There was a real effort under the last federal administration to determine listed species that were extinct, and a number of species, particularly in the Hawaiian Islands, were declared extinct and delisted under the last administration. Extinction prevention works well and is often pretty much all that's needed for recovery with generalist species, species that function well in multiple habitats, that can tolerate human activity, and often it's just determining a threat, particular threat to the species, and mitigation or elimination of that threat that can lead to their their recovery. And the bald eagle, of course, is a perfect example of extinction prevention that required mostly just a mitigation action, the elimination of DDT. Some protection is needed. Certainly, before the bald eagle was delisted, there was great effort to protect nesting sites and other important areas, but it was mostly just mitigatory action that contributed to the recovery of the bald eagle. Sadly, many of the species that require that are listed require much more than just removing an immediate threat to their survival. And that's kind of demonstrated, I think, by the pie diagram on this slide, where the purpose of recovery, of course, is to get the species population healthy enough to sustain on its own or with very little action. And if you look at the pie chart, there are only 8% of listed species, or at least in 2013, that were actually improving. And less than half were even not declining. So it points out that the real challenge to recovering species, to saving species, is being able to do those actions that contribute to recovery. So that gets me to the sort of looking at the problems with the Endangered Species Act. And as a public health professional, I look at this first part of its name, the endangered, as wait a second, why have we waited so long? You don't get a listing until the population is in critical condition, and you know, we've learned that it's much harder to do the cure, especially when it's critical condition, than to try to intervene and prevent the need for a listing to happen. And then the other point that contributes, I think, to problems with the Endangered Species Act is its focus on individual species. So let's take a look at some of the issues, I think, that are raised by it being the Endangered Species Act. And again, while I'm sort of looking at problems with the Act, where I think you know, we need to move forward, I still want to emphasize how important it is to wildlife conservation and recovery. So as I mentioned, the focus is on species. That is sort of one species at a time. And one of the problems is the listing doesn't come with a lot of automatic funding to do the needed actions for recovery. And so that's why we get the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service making decisions, listing decisions warranted but precluded. They just don't have the resources to take a species and do the necessary actions for recovery. So there's a question about how is a species selected and provided, a recovery actions provided for? Is there a sort of implicit prioritization, or is there really an explicit process? There is, to some extent, an explicit process, but there is a tendency for certain species to receive far more attention than others, and that certainly comes through in funding. As I note, the article in Issues in Ecology pointed out that the average annual spending on a listed species is $2,000 or almost $3,000 a year, but that's compared to $197 or nearly $200 million spent annually on Chinook salmon recovery. So there's a huge discrepancy in funding for species recovery. And some of that is that more money is needed to do the necessary recovery actions. But more of it's, I think, sort of less explicit triage and the need for partnerships and collaboration in recovery work. So, for example, Chinook salmon, extremely important to our indigenous communities as a food source, very popular recreational game fish. There are many groups that are interested and willing to contribute both sweat and funding to recover salmon, whereas maybe there's less attention to salamanders and other important species. So the pie chart on the bottom shows the real discrepancy in funding for species recovery. The blue is the amount spent on fish, and you can see, even though we have lots and lots of plants and lichen listed, it's that little green chunk of about 3% of the funding is spent on plants and lichens, with the second place going to birds and mammals in terms of recovery funding. Another area of concern of shortfall in the ESA is what it regulates and how it can enforce. The main regulatory authority is once a species is listed, there are protections and penalties against take of that species, against killing of that species, including actions that can lead to unintentional take, such as industrial activities or agricultural activities. Those are what can be regulated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It is not a land use law, and there's no regulation or enforcement of land use within the law, although there is certainly attention to critical habitats and a requirement for federal public lands to protect critical habitats, but it isn't really a regulatory portion of the law. And then, as we've talked about, the requirement for the development of recovery plans and how much that just involves threat elimination, which may require further policy that's outside of the realm of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. For example, protection against chemicals in the environment requires other kinds of policy. And then likewise with recovery planning. And the focus on species and the lack of triage really creates what I call the delisting conundrum. It becomes, or it's always been a challenge. While delisting is defined in the law, there are many challenges to delisting, including those that I've listed. We just don't have population status information. It was interesting studying the work of the last federal administration and the efforts that had to go into delisting, extinction delisting determinations. And monitoring is an extremely important piece of listing, understanding the population dynamics and getting a sense of the direction the population is going so that you can make adjustments to recovery actions. And a newer concept has been actually decisions to delist where there's still going to be a need for protective activities and finding partners and collaborators to carry out those protective activities. Good examples are several songbirds that are deemed fully recovered and delisted, but they're small range species, and their recovery can't be maintained unless there's control of brown-headed cowbird populations. So that control effort needs to be continued, and state fish and wildlife agencies and other federal agencies often continue to participate in conservation activities to ensure that the listing sustains. So that brings us to what is probably now considered fundamental to recovery. It's better understood as fundamental to recovery of most of the listed species, and that is they need healthy homes to live in. So it really it means that we need to bring landowners, whether they're federal, state or local governments, tribes, and private landowners as collaborators in wildlife conservation. And I list tribes here. I want to just indicate that in my years of partnering with our Washington state tribes on wildlife conservation during my years on the Fish and Wildlife Commission, I am so impressed with their knowledge and contributions to wildlife conservation. They really are leaders and quite willing, often tugging us along in terms of this need to pay attention to providing homes for critters. They understand a lot about habitat needs and restorations, and I've just been very, very impressed with the work of Washington's many tribes on whether it's salmon recovery, it's many of our large mammal recovery. I partnered with the Colville tribe on sharp-tailed grouse recovery, and they're probably leading the way there. If sharp-tailed grouse are going to recover in this state, I think the Colville tribe, or the confederated tribes of the Colville, are going to be highly responsible for that. But that said, we need also to pay attention to private landowners and their role. And recall that the Endangered Species Act is not a land use law. And in fact, when it has been promoted as in land use conflicts, I think that it's really kind of harmed the effectiveness of the law. A good example, I'm sad to say, is the northern spotted owl conflict. That really early on became a land use conflict, and that's how it was promoted. And I think that was, in retrospect, quite unfortunate because the Endangered Species Act was quite bipartisan early on, and I think we lost a lot of bipartisan support for the law as a result of trying to promote land use conflict rather than, or having conflict over land use rather than really focusing on collaborating and trying to come up with ways that we can protect wildlife and fair uses. As I've noted here, almost all listed species, or the majority of listed species, occur on private lands, and approximately 1/3 of species occur only on private lands. And if you think about it, I mean, more of the United States is in private holding than in public land holding. So we really need to look at private landowners in a collaborative way. I just read an article on tiger conservation in India, and the authors talked about land sparing and land sharing, and both are needed to ensure tiger recovery in India. And I think that's a really good way of looking at it. There's no way that government and public lands can provide enough habitat for our species that are in trouble. And we and that's sort of, we can approach it as land sparing. Really, there are only a couple of public landowners, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and state fish and wildlife agencies, that are entirely land sparing. That is, actually own land that is solely for wildlife conservation and management. Other public landowners are multi-use, recreation, extractive activities, and clearly private landowners often rely on their land for their economic support. And it becomes, I think, really important to think of land sharing and how we can carry out needed activities, traditional activities, cultural activities, economic activities on lands, and do them in a way that minimizes harm and hopefully helps wildlife and other biologic entities to survive. So there are actually things in the Endangered Species Act that kind of recognize this, and they're incentive approaches as opposed to regulatory approaches. For one, there's a portion that's called the Policy for Evaluation of Conservation Efforts. And this was actually what led, this policy for evaluation of conservation efforts is what led to the unwarranted determination for the sage grouse in 2015. The Fish and Wildlife Service and Department of Interior spent a lot of time with multiple partners, federal land agencies, state agencies, private landowners, and in anticipation of the listing decision, working on plans to ensure that habitat and shared activities were compatible with the bird's survival, or hopefully compatible with the bird's survival. There was a lot of both academic and management research to look at activities such as mining, oil drilling, placement of roads, grazing, to see what activities were totally incompatible with the bird's survival, or how they could be carried out in ways that they could actually share those functions on the land. And so what is determined with the policy for evaluation of conservation efforts is that we learned a lot about land sharing, and there was enough effort by federal and state, local governments, tribes, and private landowners in advance of that listing determination that the additional hammer of a listing was not needed. Another enticement for private landowners to participate in something like a policy for evaluation and conservation easement efforts are the candidate conservation agreements and agreements with assurances. And these are offered, it's a program that you have to develop species by species, but they're offered to private landowners who actually have species on their property that's being considered for listing. And if they will develop land use practices that will protect the species in advance, they can be issued these agreements. And the one with assurances means that if the species ends up listed, they're protected against incidental takes and penalties as long as they're following their plans for conservation of the species. These have been effective. They actually exist for the fisher in Washington State. We were working on them, and they were in place in multiple areas of the sage-grouse range prior to the 2015 determination. And the really neat thing about it is it brings in the landowners, and they actually become real champions for protection of the species. I've gone to a number of sage-grouse and sharp-tailed grouse conservation conferences and met landowners who have these CCAAs and learned of their pride and interest in conservation of the species. So there are other incentives in the ESA for landowners that have listed species. This is often done with industry, where they can develop safe harbor agreements, meaning if they have conservation protections in place that they're following with their industry practices or agricultural practices, and there happens to be an incidental take, they're protected from severe penalties as long as they've been following their agreement. And habitat conservation plans, which don't have those kinds of protections, are also something that landowners with listed species can take. More recently, they're looking at market-based approaches. These are not necessarily part of the ESA itself, but conservation organizations, land conservancy organizations have looked at market-based approaches to provide incentives to landowners and for incentivizing conservation practices. And then the government entities are really important, especially those that have multi-use land ownership. They recently have developed what we call good neighbor agreements, where U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and state wildlife agencies work with other public land entities together on conservation activities. And very important in this state and elsewhere are the Department of Agriculture, the U.S. Department of Agriculture conservation programs. A couple to point out that have been really key in Washington are State Acres for Wildlife, which is a conservation reserve program that allows the states to manage specifically for species of concern. And in addition, working lands where entities, often NGOs, partner with agriculture and grazers to manage their lands compatible with wildlife conservation. So just to kind of sum up, I think there has been, over the years, a realization that we're going to be most effective saving our wildlife if we think of it as a very collaborative process and bring in supporters from all these entities. So the final thing that I want to turn to is the wildlife profession itself, I think, has grown in terms of how it perceives and manages wildlife conservation as we've realized that we're facing a biodiversity crisis and moving away from sort of the species by species mindset, as I think all of us have today. So this has led to, after about 30 years of working with the Endangered Species Act, a law in the early 2000s that required, a federal law that required states to develop what's called a state wildlife action plan. And the idea, so all states in 2000, the law was passed in 2002. In 2005, all states were required to have state wildlife action plans, and these are to be renewed every 10 years. Washington currently has the 2015 State Wildlife Action Plan, and practically any day, actually this fall, will have its 2025 State Wildlife Action Plan. And one of the things that we say about state wildlife action plans is the idea is to keep common species common. In some ways, there's similarities to the Endangered Species Act in that states are required to identify a list of species that are called species of greatest conservation need. Currently, the 2015 Washington State Wildlife Action Plan has 268 species listed. But there are 8 elements that are required of states in their State Wildlife Action Plan. I've taken quotes about a couple of them. It shows the kind of shift from the Endangered Species Act that focuses on species whose populations are in critical condition to a more preventive approach that focuses on diversity and health of the wildlife and ecosystems that are key habitats and focus on communities within the ecosystems. And so the focus is supposed to be more on the importance of habitat systems as a whole, or ecosystems, and not just specific species. The reason that these state wildlife action plans are required is to qualify for federal funding for wildlife conservation work. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service oversees these plans. They provide grant funding for work on the species of greatest conservation need, and things like monitoring and habitat protection. And the hope is that eventually it will lead to designated federal funding rather than just grant by grant. The Congress before last, we came very close to receiving federal funding called state, can't remember what the name, Recovering America's Wildlife Act, to specifically designate funding for states to work on their, and support work on their species of greatest conservation need. Unfortunately, as we have seen, Congress doesn't pass laws like that these days, so it hasn't gotten the attention that it got when we came so close to getting the funding. However, Washington has done well and actually has provided general funding to support the state work on the species of greatest conservation need, which has been a real exciting advance of wildlife conservation in this state. Other elements of state wildlife conservation plans is it requires monitoring for the species of greatest conservation need and adaptive management. One of the things that we've discovered in having to put together state wildlife action plans is how little is known about many of the species in need, and often, at least in the 2015 priority list, often species would arrive there because we just didn't really understand the state of their population, but knew that their ecosystems and habitats were in trouble. And that is actually one of the determinations that goes into the consideration for species of greatest conservation need. One of the things that's emphasized about state wildlife action plans, actually in the law, is that they are state plans. They are not state fish and wildlife agency plans. So the planning process itself is very public, and since last fall, the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife has been holding meetings about the upcoming plan and getting public input. So while there's a lot of science that goes into the development of the plan, it is also a process of public input. In terms of adaptive management, the species of greatest conservation need, climate is called out, and there's, as we look at ecosystem protection and restoration, there's a real focus on being climate smart in Washington. Of course, that means water conservation, riparian area protection, and wildland fire prevention actions to deal with our long-term droughts and the threats that it causes to our species. Another element of state wildlife action plans emphasizes, as I noted, with the discussion about the need to focus on land use, land sharing, as well as land sparing, is partners are key to carrying out the planned activity. The idea is it's a process that also involves integration of conservation plans. The tribes in Washington are absolutely integral to the state wildlife action plan, as well as many NGOs, conservation organizations, because it's an all hands on deck effort do wildlife conservation, and the state wildlife action plans and its law recognizes that we need to all come together and collaborate. So with that, I've covered the and celebrated the ESA at 50, but also recognized that it has shortcomings in our world facing biodiversity loss, and that we're all moving forward and recognizing that there needs to be a real focus on wildlife conservation in the context of ecosystems, and engaging partners, and bringing in stewards from all facets, rather than fighting about it. We really need to come together and work on this. So with that, I'd be happy to hear if there are any questions.
Excellent. I'm going to start out, if I may, with one that Doug had answered quite early, and I think actually the answer is when you were showing your graphs of the two sage grouse coming down, and there was a little bit of further drop in the last few years, and Doug was asking, was that related to fires? And you did say drought and fires, and so that leads me to ask my innocent but uninformed question: what is it that's so special about a lek? I mean, they know, but is there something that could be replicated?
You know, I used to ask that question of my biologist colleagues when we were trying to establish a sage grouse population, de novo, in a former known range. And for the first few years, we just brought birds in, and we didn't know if we had a lek. And so I kept going, so how are we going to, how are they going to find this lek? What, you know, what goes into them making a lek? And they would chuckle at me and go, well, all we can ascertain is it needs to be where the females are. So there needs to be good nesting habitat. We know that for leks to form. The really amazing thing is they tend to return to places there have been historic leks. And when a lek was formed, it was really quite close to where a historic lek had been, even though, you know, there were changes in land use and everything. So
The little magnets in their heads, the little magnets in their heads knew where to go.
yeah, something like that.
Huh. Well, it wasn't that long ago that we enjoyed saying, when they go low, we'll go high. And I'm wondering, Kim, how you're able to go so high and positive, and what wedge of action and strategy have you been finding works for you these X months?
I think just sort of getting out and doing it, you know, and I think one of the things is collaborating and partnerships, and going out. I love doing habitat projects where it's several conservation organizations that come together. You know, we have a planting party. It's just, you know, and these are all people, they may have a little bit different reasons. I worked together with Pheasants Forever on a habitat restoration project a year ago, as Spokane Audubon did. And we just all really enjoyed ourselves. Now, we were doing it to provide habitat for sharp-tailed grouse. But they were going, yeah, but it's providing habitat for our pheasants and our partridge and everything else. So it's just enjoy those kinds of relationships.
Yes.
We're all looking for the same thing ultimately, but we have sort of different traditions and cultures.
I'd like to mention, thanks to Kim, I was able to put in some very relevant links in the chat. Don't you love links? Golly, if you just click on them now while we're all enjoying chatting, they'll open up windows that you can look at later. Also, when the wonderful recording goes into our YouTube site, I always put these links down below too, in case anyone's missed this chance. But that SWAP, love that, State Wildlife Action Plan, is our state's SWAP is going to be revised by October of this year, as Kim knows, and they are accepting written suggestions. And if you get into that thing, I mean, the 2015 one is massive. I mean, it must be 100 pages, and it's detailed, and it does include plants, by the way. One question was asked, so it's quite a journey of discovery, so to speak, there. Glancing here, I know there's some key question that someone wants to ask, and they're just being a little shy. Come on. Oh, actually, I have no memory, so I put in the chat for me, extinction delisting. What does that mean? What was that point you were making?
So when a listed species is determined to be extinct, it's delisted. It goes through the process in the Act to be delisted. But as I mentioned, that's not always easy to determine. So a lot of effort was put into it recently, and it added to that number of species that has been delisted as a result of extinction. Mm-hmm. Not our favorite way to delist.
As you pointed out, when the ESA first was created, and there were no plants and no, I can't remember, amphibians or anything, and people just weren't looking. They weren't recording what was happening. And I think to some degree we would see the same thing in these swaps, that gee, there's certain states that don't have anything listed, like I think Arkansas, because they're not looking. So there's a lot of relativeness to this all. Yeah.
Yeah, we can be fortunate to Washington that there is a lot of attention paid to wildlife conservation. Mm-hmm. We have a good
I wanted to thank Carol, one of our participants, when you mentioned that most land in this country is privately owned. She diligently found the link, and it's 60%, according to that graphic that we looked at, she and I, 60% versus 29% federal. So 1/3, 2/3. A little bit of some other stuff there too. Yeah.
Yeah, and even there, as I mentioned, not all public land is devoted solely to wildlife conservation. A lot of it's multi-use, and we need to learn how to share with our uses, recreation, for example. How can we do that and ensure that wildlife have room too?
Well, I don't know who's on the commission now, but Kim, when you were there, some of the writings that came out talking about, here's a person who's not a hunter, but she sees the inside story to the hunting community and the habitat and how it all crosses together. And I hope that philosophy is continuing.
Yes, if you look at the contributions that hunters and hunting have made to wildlife conservation, they're the leaders. There are organizations like Pheasants Forever, Ducks Unlimited, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation that are really conservation organizations and real leaders. Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation has probably produced some of the best research on land connectivity and wildlife corridors, and how important it is as we fragment land to protect these areas. They've looked at things like fencing and how threatening it is to wildlife, and really have led the research on that.
Thank you. And a little red mark just showed up. I really like your points about not waiting for endangerment and not focusing on only one species at a time. What are chances of this changing? Rhetorical question.
You mean it's changing in the Endangered Species Act?
Mindy, if you want to say anything, feel free to. Anyone who has a comment they want to, feel free to unmute or type it out, whichever you wish.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it just seemed like such really good points you made about that. And so I don't know about how it could change, but it would make perfect sense for it to be to change so that it's not waiting till the very critical moments, and also taking a more global approach.
So I think that really is what happened with the State Wildlife Action Plan law. To move to that more global approach and put real focus on that, and actually what would be important would be to try and, or is to continue to advocate for the federal funding of that law. I mean, there was a real movement going forward until everything just sort of stopped in Congress with the last session. But hopefully that will come back again, and we can start discussing. There are groups, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies sort of leads them, but a lot of nonprofits and everything that continue to advocate for adequate funding for the state wildlife action plans. I think that would make a big difference in terms of having this more ecosystem approach. As I said, Washington's really been a leader, and it has its state fish and wildlife agency has really a large focus now on conservation of wildlife communities, ecosystems. The state has identified ecosystems of greatest conservation need: the Columbia Basin shrub steppe, the coastal prairies. So Washington is kind of ahead in this area. As far as the Endangered Species Act, I think it's fortunate that it has enough flexibility to actually implement these actions, things like the policy on conservation and the actions they can take with private landowners to develop incentives. So I think, there has been a trend to use those actions more than listing and regulation of individual species. So, I think we're all hesitant to, because the act is no longer well supported in a bipartisan fashion, we're all reluctant to look at the act itself, but in terms of amendments, but to learn how to use the act in a way that focuses really on ecosystem and critical habitat and partnerships.
Well, we have to leave everyone with a happy thought. You said 1973, and Rachel Carson, I think I had to cheat a little bit. Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring in 1962. What were you doing in 1962? We were in, you were in grade school, Kim. I don't know, but you know, the leadership and the images that have brought us to where we are, they will not just fade off. So hang in
Oh.
there, everybody. Anyone else? I see a nice big this. Well,
Yes.
Kim, I've been trying to get you to come talk to us for some time. I know you have such a busy and impactful life. Thank you so much for being our speaker tonight, and all the best.
Thank you, and thanks everybody. I enjoyed it.